Series Sovereignty Files, Sovereign, Story End, February 2019. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let the tension in your shoulders release. Let your jaw unclench. Let the weight of the day settle somewhere beneath you where it cannot reach. You are here, in this moment, and what happened has already happened, and the only thing left is to understand it. Imagine a lock, not a physical lock, not brass and steel and a keyhole you could pick with the right tool. Imagine a digital lock, a string of characters, a password, a sequence of letters and numbers and symbols that exist in a specific order and that order alone, and that without those characters in that precise arrangement will not open for any force or any argument or any amount of money. And imagine that the only person who knows that combination is gone, not missing, not hiding, gone. His name was Gerald Cotton. He was 30 years old when he died in a hospital in Jaipur, India, in December 2018, while on his honeymoon, or so the story goes, and the story is confirmed by DNA analysis and forensic examination and the weight of every official finding. And yet the story refuses to close completely in the minds of the 76,000 people who trusted him with their money. He ran Canada's largest cryptocurrency exchange. He was the CEO, the technical architect, and the sole person who possessed the passwords to the cold storage wallets where most of Quadriga's customer funds were kept. And when he died, or when he disappeared, depending on which version of events your exhausted credulity will accept, he took $250 million in other people's money into the silence with him. The story of QuadrigaCX is not simply the story of a financial collapse, though it is certainly that. It is not simply the story of a fraud, though the evidence is overwhelming that it was one. It is something stranger and darker and more philosophically unsettling. A story about what happens when a single human being becomes the irreplaceable custodian of a digital key, and what that concentration of access means for everyone who placed their trust in the institution that key controls. It is a story that produced conspiracy theories robust enough to survive forensic refutation. It is a story that generated a court-authorized exhumation that confirmed the death and still did not satisfy everyone. And it is a story the cryptocurrency industry has spent years studying, because the question at its center, who holds the keys and what happens to those keys when that person is gone, remains the most consequential question in digital asset security. Gerald William Cotton was born in 1988 in Belleville, Ontario, a mid-sized city on the Bay of Quinte that sits at the unremarkable intersection of small-town Canada and the broader world of the Internet, which was, during Cotton's formative years, beginning to transform both simultaneously. He was the kind of child who read ahead of his grade level, who found the edges of whatever system he had been placed in, and pressed against them, not with defiance, but with the particular curiosity of someone who understood that the edges were interesting, precisely because most people stopped before reaching them. By 15, he was writing software, not for school assignments, not for peer approval, but because he wanted to understand how the tools he used were assembled, because the gap between using a system and understanding a system was a gap he found intolerable to leave unclosed. By 16, he had found the online forums where the idea of digital money was being worked out in technical terms that most of the Internet hadn't caught up to yet. Discussions of cryptographic systems, privacy architectures, the possibility that the Internet could become its own financial infrastructure rather than simply a faster version of the physical commerce that preceded it. These forums were populated in the mid-2000s by libertarians who distrusted central banks, by cryptographers who thought about privacy as a technical problem more than a political one, by programmers who were building things that didn't exist yet, because the tools to build them had only recently become available. and by young men with the specific combination of technical fluency and future orientation that made them capable of taking abstract ideas seriously before those ideas had any practical application. Cotton was 21 years old when Bitcoin emerged in 2009. He had been primed for it for years. He saw in Bitcoin not just a technology, but an opportunity, a first-mover advantage available to anyone willing to act before the broader market understood what was in front of it. In 2013, he co-founded QuadrigaCX with a man named Michael Patron. The name Quadriga referred to a four-horse chariot from classical antiquity, a symbol of speed, power, and forward momentum that had decorated triumphal arches and commemorative coins across the ancient Mediterranean world. The pitch was clean and precisely calibrated for the Canadian market. A domestic platform where ordinary Canadians could buy and sell Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies using Canadian dollars without the complexity of foreign exchange, without the opacity of overseas transfers, without the anxiety of dealing with platforms that operated in jurisdictions where Canadian consumer protection law held no force. It was positioned as the accessible, trustworthy domestic alternative to the chaotic global exchange landscape dominated by Mt. Gox and a handful of offshore platforms whose regulatory status was unclear and whose customer service was, by all accounts, non-existent. Before the exchange launched, Cotton spent months studying the landscape of what existed. Not just Mt. Gox, whose dominant position made it the unavoidable reference point, but the smaller platforms that had appeared in its shadow, the ways they handled deposits and withdrawals, and the critical problem of converting fiat currency to cryptocurrency and back. The existing options for Canadian users were all compromised in some way. Offshore platforms that held funds in jurisdictions where Canadian consumer protection law had no reach, gray market services that operated through complicated workarounds with Canadian banks, or direct peer-to-peer arrangements that required a level of technical sophistication most retail users simply didn't have. Cotton identified the specific gap in the market: a domestically licensed, bank-connected, professionally presented Canadian exchange, and built QuadrigaCX to fill it. The early marketing was clean and transparent about what it was: an exchange for Canadians, using Canadian dollars, operating in compliance with Canadian rules. The pitch worked because it was addressing a real need, and because the broader market was expanding fast enough that a well-positioned domestic exchange could accumulate users simply by being the most accessible option for people who were arriving at cryptocurrency for the first time and who wanted to deal with a platform that felt familiar rather than foreign. The timing was fortuitous in ways that had nothing to do with Cotton's planning and everything to do with the broader market cycle. Bitcoin's price was beginning, in late 2013, the spectacular ascent that would take it from roughly $100 to over $1,000 by year's end, the first of the exponential price movements that would define cryptocurrency's cultural presence for the following decade. Every mainstream news story about Bitcoin sent new users to their search engines, and the search engines sent them to Quadriga, which was the most accessible option for anyone entering through the Canadian financial system. By 2018, QuadrigaCX was processing hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions per year, serving a customer base that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and carrying the designation of Canada's largest cryptocurrency exchange without serious challenge. Cotton was the CEO, the public face at industry conferences, and, crucially, the technical architect who managed the exchange's infrastructure, controlled its wallets, and held the private keys to the cold storage where the majority of customer funds were kept offline and protected from the persistent attempts at theft that any internet-connected asset faced. He was young and charming and wore the fleece vests of a founder who had built something real. He gave thoughtful interviews about decentralized finance and the future of money. He had a secret that would eventually destroy all of it. To understand what happened at Quadriga, it is necessary to understand a fundamental distinction in how cryptocurrency is stored. A distinction that sounds technical, but is really about the eternal problem of security versus accessibility, and about the specific ways that cryptocurrency makes that problem more acute than it has ever been in any prior form of money. Hot wallets are cryptocurrency holdings connected to the internet, accessible, liquid, available in real time for processing customer deposits and withdrawals, and correspondingly vulnerable to any attacker who can find a path through the software, through the network, through the human beings who manage the system. The history of cryptocurrency exchange security is in substantial part a history of hot wallet compromises, of the specific attack vectors that sophisticated adversaries have used to drain internet-connected holdings from exchanges that did not secure them adequately. Cold wallets are the opposite, hardware devices or encrypted files stored on computers that have never connected to the internet, whose private keys exist only in offline environments that a remote attacker cannot reach, regardless of how sophisticated the attack. Cold storage is the standard approach for protecting the majority of customer assets at any responsible exchange. The recognition that not all assets need to be instantly accessible, and that the assets not immediately needed for liquidity should be protected by the strongest available security architecture. At responsible operations, cold storage is managed with explicit redundancy designed around a simple premise. Any single person may, at any time, become unavailable through incapacity or death or circumstances beyond their control, and the funds they manage must remain accessible regardless. Multiple executives hold keys. Cryptographic key-splitting techniques require several parties to cooperate before any major withdrawal can be authorized. Legal documentation governs who inherits access rights. The entire architecture is designed by people who have thought seriously about what happens when any single point fails. The difference between these two approaches, the responsible multi-party architecture and the single custodian model, is not a difference in technical capability. The cryptographic tools needed to implement redundant multi-party key management existed long before Quadriga was founded. They were not expensive. They were not difficult to deploy for anyone with Cotton's level of technical sophistication. The decision not to use them was not a consequence of resource constraints or technical limitations or unfamiliarity with the options. It was a decision made by someone who had the means to implement best practices and chose not to, and who, as the investigation would later establish, had reasons for preferring that no one else have access to the wallets that his customers believed were being protected on their behalf. Quadriga had Gerald Cotton, the encrypted laptop that held access to the exchange's cold storage wallets, the wallets where most of customer cryptocurrency had been moved for safekeeping, was protected by a master password that Cotton had not shared with anyone, had not written down anywhere that could be found, and had not included in any legal or operational documentation. Whether this was a design failure, a product of a founder who had grown faster than his operational processes, or something more deliberate, a security choice that conveniently concentrated control in a way that served purposes beyond security, is a question the investigation could not finally answer. What it could establish was that the choice was made, and that its consequences would eventually fall entirely on the customers who had deposited funds on the assumption that the exchange holding them was professionally managed. There was also a more immediate problem that the cold storage architecture was partially obscuring. From 2017 through 2018, Canadian banks began terminating their relationships with Quadriga in a pattern that should have been visible as an institutional distress signal, but that the exchange managed to explain to customers as temporary operational difficulties. CIBC, one of Canada's 5 major chartered banks, froze approximately $25 million in funds that had been deposited through a payment processing relationship, citing anti-money laundering compliance concerns and the opacity of Quadriga's customer verification procedures. The money was frozen not because it had been identified as criminal proceeds, but because the bank's due diligence processes could not satisfy themselves about the provenance of transactions flowing through accounts that were difficult to characterize through normal commercial patterns. Court proceedings were required to resolve the dispute. During the months the funds were frozen, customers who tried to withdraw Canadian dollars could not access their money, and the explanation they received, banking difficulties, a dispute with a financial institution, temporary delays that would soon be resolved, was true enough in its details to be credible, and misleading enough in its omissions to function as a form of concealment. The invisible problem was far worse than the banking difficulties. What no one outside the exchange knew, what would only emerge through forensic investigation after the collapse, was that Cotton had been conducting a systematic fraud inside his own platform for a period that investigators would later establish extended well before the banking problems began. He had created fake user accounts using pseudonyms, including the name Chris Marquet. He had credited these accounts with fictional cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, that he had simply invented by entering numbers into the exchange's database. No actual cryptocurrency sat behind these credits. They were fabrications, digital entries that looked identical to legitimate holdings, but corresponded to no actual assets anywhere in the blockchain. He used these fictional holdings to trade against real customers on his own platform, functioning as a casino owner who had printed his own chips and was using them at a table where the other players were gambling with real money. When his fictitious positions were profitable, real customer cryptocurrency flowed to accounts he controlled. When markets moved against him, he transferred additional real customer assets to cover the gap. By late 2018, the hole this operation had created was of a magnitude that made it impossible to continue concealing. October 2018, Gerald Cotton and Jennifer Robertson announced their engagement. They had been together for several years. She was a real estate agent from Halifax, Nova Scotia, practical and warm and attentive to the details of daily life that Cotton, absorbed in code and markets, sometimes let slip past him. She complimented him in the way that some partnerships do, her groundedness against his abstraction, her attention to present circumstance against his orientation toward future possibility. She knew him as a person who worked hard, who was intensely private about the technical details of his work, who was generous and affectionate in the domestic dimensions of their shared life. She did not know, or at least there is no evidence that she knew, that the technical work he was so private about included the systematic deception of hundreds of thousands of customers and the misappropriation of funds they had placed in his exchange's care. On November 8, 2018, they married in Nova Scotia. By all accounts, it was a genuine celebration, the kind of wedding that people remember as happy, not as a performance staged for an audience, not as a step in a carefully planned sequence of actions, but as simply a wedding. 3 weeks later, they were on a plane to India. The honeymoon they had been planning for months, a journey through the subcontinent in December, the cooler season, the time of festivals and accessible travel, the period when India's extraordinary density of culture and landscape is most hospitable to visitors from northern climates. Jaipur was on the itinerary, the pink city, named for the terracotta-colored sandstone of its old city architecture, home to the Amber Fort rising from its surrounding hills. and the extraordinary bazaars and palaces of a Rajput capital, whose grandeur had survived the transitions from empire to independence and from medieval to modern. It is one of the great cities to visit in the world, and they were there on their honeymoon. And then Gerald Cotton was sick. The broader context in which the honeymoon was occurring was invisible to Jennifer Robertson and to nearly everyone outside the exchange's internal operations. Cotton knew in December 2018 that the operation he had been running was failing. The cold storage wallets had been drained of customer funds since April. The fake trading accounts had generated losses that real customer deposits could no longer cover. The banking problems that had been freezing customer withdrawals through 2017 and 2018 were making the normal operations of the exchange increasingly difficult to sustain, and the gap between what customers were owed and what the exchange actually held had grown large enough that any serious attempt at reconciliation would expose the fraud. Whether Cotton, boarding the plane to India in late November 2018, had a specific plan for what would happen when he returned, whether he was working toward an exit, a confession, a restructuring of some kind, is something the investigation could not determine. The only person who knew what he intended has been unable to speak to it. On December 9, 2018, he was admitted to a hospital in Jaipur. The diagnosis was complications arising from Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel condition he had been managing for years, a chronic illness that is serious and that requires ongoing medical attention, but that, in people with access to modern medical care, rarely reaches the severity of what followed. 2 days after admission, on December 11, 2018, Gerald Cotton died. He was 30 years old. Jennifer Robertson was with him. She returned to Canada with his remains, devastated by the sudden loss of a person she loved. And then, as the days passed and the implications of his death became clear, by the discovery of what his death meant for hundreds of thousands of people she had never met. She found the laptop. She tried to access it. She could not. She searched his papers for instructions and found provisions for the car insurance, detailed instructions for the care of the dogs they had kept together, instructions that included a trust fund specifically for their welfare, and nothing, anywhere, about the cold wallet. No master password written down, no backup key holder named, no succession plan for the assets that $250 million of customer money depended on. The laptop was inaccessible, and the man who knew the combination to the lock was buried. January 14, 2019. Quadriga's website went dark, and in its place appeared a notice that would become one of the most closely read documents in cryptocurrency history, not for its literary quality, but for what it implied about the fragility of every digital institution that concentrated critical access in a single human being. The notice announced Cotton's death in India the previous December and stated, without apparent awareness of how extraordinary the statement was, that he had been the sole holder of the cold wallet password, and that the company therefore did not have access to the majority of its digital assets. For the cryptocurrency community, reading this notice for the first time, the experience was something between shock and a specific cold-running disbelief. The sensation of reading a sentence that cannot mean what it says, and then rereading it and finding that it means exactly what it says. The creditors who would eventually be registered in the court process came from every income level and every degree of cryptocurrency sophistication. Some had deposited what represented a significant fraction of their life savings, drawn to the exchange's reputation and domestic credibility in a way that larger institutional investors might not have been. Because institutional investors had compliance departments and due diligence processes and custodial arrangements that retail users had no access to. Some were young professionals who had moved significant positions into cryptocurrency during the 2017 bull market and had not yet withdrawn them. Some were long-term cryptocurrency users who had been customers of Quadriga since its early days and who had trusted it with increasingly large holdings as it grew. The diversity of the creditor pool was itself a commentary on what Quadriga had represented: the accessible, domestic, trustworthy on-ramp for ordinary Canadians who wanted to participate in a new asset class without navigating the complexity and opacity of the global exchange landscape. The trust placed in the exchange had been precisely calibrated to the presentation the exchange made of itself, and the presentation had been, at every level, fraudulent. The initial response moved through shock into something harder and more focused within hours. Users with funds on the platform, some of whom had been unable to process withdrawals for weeks before the announcement, some of whom had deposited the equivalent of years of savings, some of whom were holding cryptocurrency positions in volatile markets and urgently needed to manage their exposure, were now reading that the inaccessibility of their funds was the direct result of a security architecture that had concentrated the entire exchange's operational continuity in a single person who was now dead. The forums and Telegram groups and Twitter threads where these users gathered developed, within a day, the specific argumentative structure of a community that has been collectively wronged and is searching for an explanation that makes sense of the scale of what has happened to them. The story was too convenient. The CEO, who happened to be the sole key holder, happened to die, at 30 years old, of a condition that is not typically fatal in patients with access to good medical care, in a country with substantially less forensic capability and regulatory coordination with Canada than any domestic death would have triggered, just as the exchange was, investigators would later confirm, already functionally insolvent. The probability calculation that produced this chain of coincidences was not impossible, but it was uncomfortable in a way that generated immediate suspicion among people who had been trained by years in cryptocurrency markets to look for the hidden structure beneath the surface narrative. Was Gerald Cotton really dead? Had he faked his death? Had he arranged a new identity and a life in a jurisdiction without extradition? And was he watching the consequences unfold from a distance? Was this the most elaborate exit scam in the history of a market that had already seen some extraordinary exit scams? The questions came fast, and they did not stop, because the people asking them had lost real money and had no other avenue through which to process the loss. The Ontario Securities Commission launched a formal investigation. Ernst & Young was appointed by the Ontario Superior Court of Justice as court-appointed monitor, the functional equivalent of a bankruptcy administrator, charged with locating and protecting assets and eventually distributing them to creditors. Their findings, released in stages through 2019, were extraordinary in a way that went beyond the already extraordinary facts of the initial announcement. Extraordinary because they revealed not just that the money was gone, but that it had been gone for far longer than anyone had known, and that the mechanism by which it had disappeared was more systematic and more deliberate than a simple failure of security architecture could explain. The cold wallets that Quadriga claimed held the majority of customer cryptocurrency were empty, not partially depleted, not recently moved in response to Cotton's death. Empty, and forensic blockchain analysis established that most had been empty since April 2018, more than 8 months before Cotton died, months before the wedding in Nova Scotia, months before the honeymoon in Jaipur. The cryptocurrency that hundreds of thousands of customers had deposited on the assumption that it was sitting in secure cold storage had moved through a complex series of transactions that took months of forensic analysis to trace, to external exchanges and personal accounts under Cotton's control. $115 million in Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, and other cryptocurrencies had left Quadriga's cold wallets and moved somewhere else before Cotton's death was ever announced. The death was not the cause of the loss. The loss was already complete before the death occurred. Tracing the cryptocurrency that had left Quadriga's cold wallets required the specific forensic capability that blockchain analysis provides. The ability to follow the movement of digital assets across a public ledger that records every transaction in an immutable, time-stamped sequence. The blockchain does not lie. Every transfer, every wallet address, every amount, and every moment of every movement is recorded in a public record that no one can retroactively alter. What the blockchain cannot do is translate wallet addresses into identities. That step requires additional investigation, subpoenas, cooperation from other exchanges, and the slow work of connecting the digital trail to the physical people and institutions at the end of it. Ernst & Young's forensic team, working with blockchain analytics firms, spent months on this work, and what they traced was a pattern of deliberate, systematic, sophisticated fund movement designed to obscure the destination of assets that had originated as customer deposits. Some funds were moved to external cryptocurrency exchanges under Cotton's personal accounts. Some were converted to fiat currency through methods that complicated the tracing. Some moved through intermediate wallets in patterns that suggested an awareness of blockchain forensics and an attempt to complicate the analysis, which itself was evidence of intent, of someone who understood that the blockchain could be used to follow the money and who was trying to make the following harder. The forensic investigation then turned to the trading records and found what Cotton had been doing inside the exchange. The 14 fake accounts operating under pseudonyms, the fictional cryptocurrency credits that represented hundreds of millions of dollars in fabricated positions, the systematic transfer of real customer assets to cover losses generated by these phantom trades, the operation that had been running for long enough and at large enough scale to produce losses that dwarfed any reasonable interpretation of what a legitimate exchange operator might have done wrong. The picture that emerged from the blockchain records, the database logs, and the transaction history was not a picture of a man who had made terrible choices under pressure. It was a picture of a man who had built his exchange from an early stage around a fraudulent mechanism, who had used the vocabulary of cryptocurrency security to conceal the fraud from customers and from regulators who lacked the technical tools to look beneath the surface, and who had spent the proceeds on real estate, private aircraft, luxury travel, and personal expenses that bore no relationship to the operation of a legitimate business. The investigation also surfaced a significant fact about Michael Patron, the co-founder who had departed Quadriga in 2016 under circumstances that had not been publicly explained at the time. His real name was Omar Danani. He had been convicted in the United States of identity theft, bank fraud, and credit card fraud, connected to a website that trafficked in stolen financial data. He had served time in a federal prison, subsequently changed his name, established a new identity, and entered the cryptocurrency industry, a sector whose early regulatory environment was sufficiently unstructured that a person with a criminal history could participate without the background checks that would have been routine in any regulated financial context. He had eventually become the co-founder of Canada's largest cryptocurrency exchange. The foundation on which QuadrigaCX had been built was, from its beginning, something other than what customers had been told it was. The doubts about Cotton's death were not paranoid fantasies generated by grief-maddened creditors. They had structural reasons, details in the documented record that, taken individually, could each be explained by circumstance but that accumulated into a pattern that demanded explanation. The death certificate issued in Jaipur contained errors and inconsistencies that Indian administrative procedures and the differences between Canadian and Indian documentation standards might explain, but that Canadian investigators noted without finding entirely reassuring. The obituary for Cotton appeared on a cryptocurrency forum, posted using a Quadriga-associated account, before the official death notice had been formally issued to Canadian authorities or to the exchange's own users. The timeline of events in Jaipur, the hospital admission, the death, the notification to Jennifer, the notification to the board, produced answers from the company that did not align cleanly with the questions being asked. None of these details proved anything individually. Collectively, they kept the doubt alive. And then there was the matter of the will. Gerald Cotton had updated his will 11 days before the trip to India, after the wedding, before the honeymoon, in a legal action whose timing was, at minimum, notable. The will left his estate to Jennifer Robertson, real estate in Nova Scotia, a Cessna aircraft, a sailing yacht, a Range Rover, other assets accumulated through years of operating an exchange whose customer funds he had been systematically misappropriating. He made detailed provisions for his dogs, Nitro and Gully, a trust fund, specific instructions about their care and living arrangements, the kind of documentation that a thoughtful person produces when they are planning for their own possible absence. He made no provision for Quadriga's customers. He provided no instructions for accessing the cold wallet. He named no backup key holder. He explained nothing. Anywhere in the legal documentation he had taken the specific care to update 11 days before the trip about how the 76,000 people whose money he held in trust should be able to access their funds if something happened to him. The conspiracy theories that these facts generated have that rational argument does not easily extinguish, because their core claim is not that the forensic evidence is wrong, but that the coincidences require explanation that the official record does not fully supply. The creditor community that organized around the Quadriga collapse was, like the Mt. Gox creditor community before it, a group of people that the normal operations of financial markets had never prepared for the specific legal and institutional situation they found themselves in. They hired lawyers. They formed advocacy organizations. They engaged with the court-appointed monitor, with the OSC, with law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions. They published detailed analyses of the blockchain evidence, produced timelines, identified inconsistencies in the official narrative, and maintained a sustained presence in the proceedings that lasted years. The specific technical literacy that cryptocurrency users bring to these situations, the ability to read blockchain explorers, to trace wallet addresses, to understand the forensic significance of on-chain patterns, made them more capable participants in the investigation than unsophisticated retail creditors in a conventional insolvency proceeding would typically be. They found things that the official investigators subsequently confirmed. They asked questions that the official record eventually answered. And they did all of this while dealing with the ordinary emotional weight of having lost money they could not afford to lose, in circumstances whose strangeness and ambiguity made the normal processes of grievance and acceptance harder to complete. The Nova Scotia Supreme Court approved the exhumation of Gerald Cotton's body in December 2019, more than a year after his claimed death. Forensic pathologists and DNA analysts examined the remains. The conclusion was unambiguous within the framework of what forensic science can establish. The body was Gerald Cotton, confirmed by DNA analysis, with physical evidence consistent with the cause and manner of death described in the Indian death certificate. For many people, this was the definitive answer. For others, it was not. And the persistence of that uncertainty is not simply irrationality. It is the natural response of people who lost very large amounts of money, who trusted an institution that turned out to have been built on fraud, and who find it difficult to accept that the explanation for so much damage is simply that a young man made terrible choices, died young, and left no way in. That the story ends not with a villain who can be prosecuted and a scheme that can be fully unwound, but with a grave in Nova Scotia and an encrypted laptop and $250 million that may be mathematically inaccessible forever. That the explanation is just loss, with no further accountability available. Jennifer Robertson had nothing to do with it. That finding, consistent across every investigation, every court proceeding, every examination of the evidence, is worth stating with the same directness it deserves. She was a real estate agent from Nova Scotia who had fallen in love with a man and married him in good faith, and had no meaningful knowledge of the fraud he was conducting from behind the screens she saw him working at in the private spaces of their domestic life. She did not know about the false trading accounts. She did not know the cold storage wallets were empty. She did not know that the properties and the aircraft and the yacht she was receiving under his will had been purchased with money that belonged to customers who had trusted him and who were, at that moment, trying to understand how their withdrawal requests had stopped processing. She knew him as someone who was intensely private about the details of his technical work, which had always seemed like the reasonable privacy of a founder who was protective of competitive information. She did not know she was married to a man who was running a fraud, and yet she had received the assets. The real estate in Nova Scotia, the Cessna aircraft, the sailing yacht, the Range Rover, the cash proceeds of years of an operation that had taken from customers to fund the life she shared with him without knowing how it was funded. The court-appointed monitor representing Quadriga's creditors filed suit, not on the theory that she had been a knowing participant in the fraud, but on the simpler legal principle that assets purchased with customer money were customer money, regardless of the good faith of the person who received them, and should be returned to the pool from which creditors would be compensated. She settled. She agreed to return approximately $12 million in assets to the court-supervised process: the aircraft, the yacht, properties, other holdings. She cooperated with the investigation. She was not charged with any crime. She was not found to have known what her husband was doing. She was, in the assessment of every legal body that examined her situation, a victim of the fraud rather than a beneficiary of it. A woman who had built a life with someone who turned out to be someone other than the person she had built it with, and who discovered that truth only when the institution he had built collapsed around her. The $12 million she returned was a small fraction of the total losses. The creditor pool that it entered was still vastly smaller than what 76,000 people were owed. Her legal obligation was to return what could be identified as coming from customer funds, not to compensate the full harm, which was the harm of the fraud itself, a harm that no estate recovery could fully address. Her position in the story is one of its genuinely sympathetic elements. A person without culpability who nonetheless spent years in the middle of a legal process that required her to surrender the material remains of a life she had not known was fraudulent, and who carried the additional private burden of understanding after his death that the person she had grieved was not entirely the person she had known. In November 2023, the Ontario Securities Commission released its final report on QuadrigaCX, the product of years of investigation, thousands of documents, hours of testimony, and the most complete forensic blockchain analysis of a Canadian cryptocurrency fraud that the country's financial regulators had ever conducted. The conclusion was delivered in the measured language that regulatory findings require without the moral weight that the situation deserved in ordinary prose, and it was unambiguous. Gerald Cotton had operated QuadrigaCX as a fraud from an early stage in the exchange's existence. He had systematically misappropriated customer funds for personal use over a period of years. He had used fake trading accounts to manipulate his own platform in ways that transferred real customer cryptocurrency to his control. He had spent the proceeds on real estate, aircraft, luxury travel, and personal expenses that bore no relationship to the operation of a legitimate business. He was not a visionary entrepreneur who made catastrophic mistakes under pressure in the final months of a struggling operation. He was a fraudster who had used the vocabulary and infrastructure of cryptocurrency, its technical complexity, its opacity to regulators, its culture of privacy and individual responsibility, to run a scheme whose essential structure was Ponzi, using new customer deposits to service the obligations to earlier customers while continuously diverting funds to personal use until the obligations exceeded any capacity to meet them. The report's criticism extended beyond Cotton to the regulatory environment that had made the fraud possible for as long as it ran. QuadrigaCX had operated in a gap, the space between financial regulations written for a pre-cryptocurrency world and a new class of financial intermediaries that no existing framework had been designed to govern. No Canadian securities regulator had exercised meaningful oversight over the exchange's operations, had required it to demonstrate that it held the assets it claimed to hold, or had established any mandatory standards for the custody of customer funds. The same regulatory vacuum that made cryptocurrency useful for people seeking financial autonomy outside traditional institutions was the vacuum through which a fraud of this scale could be conducted for years, in plain sight, with hundreds of thousands of customers. The reforms that followed, mandatory proof of reserves, requirements for multi-signature custody architecture, registration and ongoing supervision by securities regulators, were substantial, and most were eventually implemented or incorporated into frameworks that came into effect in Canada in subsequent years. For 76,000 users who lost money, the reforms came after the fact. The relationship between the OSC's findings and the possibility of criminal prosecution was complicated by the same fact that complicated every aspect of accountability in the Quadriga case. The person who had committed the fraud was dead. Canadian criminal law requires a living accused. The fraud that the OSC documented in extensive detail, the fabricated accounts, the misappropriated funds, the years of systematic deception, could not be prosecuted because the perpetrator was not available to be prosecuted. The report served as the authoritative historical record of what had happened and as the foundation for the regulatory reforms that followed, but it could not produce the criminal accountability that 76,000 creditors had some right to expect from an operation that had been run, according to the findings, as a deliberate fraud for years. This gap between what the investigation established and what the legal system could do with those findings was one more layer of the specific frustration that defined the Quadriga experience for the people who were harmed by it. The answer was clear. The remedy was limited. The man responsible was unavailable. The court process to identify and compensate creditors stretched over years and produced outcomes that were, even in the context of cryptocurrency exchange collapses, unusually painful in their incompleteness. The total assets recovered through the bankruptcy process, from the return of Robertson's received assets, from tracing funds to external exchanges, from recovering what could be identified as Cotton's personal holdings, were a fraction of the total losses. Most creditors received a portion of what they were owed, calculated on a fiat dollar basis that did not capture the full impact of the lost cryptocurrency at prices that had continued rising through the recovery process. Some received nothing. The 48 months between the January 2019 announcement and the final distributions were, for people who had lost real money, years of waiting in a legal process that was moving at the speed of institutional justice toward outcomes that could never fully compensate the harm. QuadrigaCX taught the cryptocurrency industry two things that the industry had known in abstract principle but had not fully absorbed until the catastrophic illustration that the case provided. The first lesson was about custody, specifically about the specific and catastrophic risk of concentrating key access in a single human being. The blockchain technology underlying cryptocurrency is designed around a distributed architecture where no single point of failure can compromise the whole. No single server, no single participant, no single institution whose failure would bring the entire network down. The irony of what happened at Quadriga is that this fundamentally distributed technology was deployed through an institution that concentrated its entire operational continuity, the ability to access the funds it held in trust, in one person who happened to die. The most dangerous point of failure in cryptocurrency is not the blockchain. It is the human custodian, the person who holds the private keys, on whose continued availability and honesty and competence the entire structure of trust depends. Proof of reserves, the cryptographic demonstration that an exchange holds the assets its records claim to hold, became a baseline expectation after Quadriga, a minimum standard that reputable exchanges competed to demonstrate rather than an optional transparency gesture. The specific mechanism is straightforward in principle. An exchange should be able to prove, using the public blockchain record, that the wallets it claims to control actually contain the cryptocurrency attributed to customer accounts. Before Quadriga, this was a niche demand of technically sophisticated users who understood what it would reveal. After Quadriga, it became a standard that any exchange claiming legitimacy needed to meet. Distributed key management, systems that require multiple independent key holders to cooperate before any major withdrawal can be authorized, designed specifically so that no single person's death or incapacity can render funds inaccessible, became standard cold storage practice at operations whose founders had studied what Quadriga had done wrong. Multi-signature authorization, hardware security modules, key-splitting protocols. The entire vocabulary of institutional cryptocurrency custody was shaped by the specific failure that one young man in Jaipur had made not just possible, but inevitable. The international dimension of the Quadriga aftermath extended beyond Canada in ways that illustrated how thoroughly cryptocurrency had outgrown any single jurisdiction's capacity to govern it. Cotton had moved funds to exchanges operating in multiple countries. The process of recovering those funds, or even of determining where they had gone, required cooperation between Canadian authorities, international law enforcement, and private exchanges, whose obligations to share information with Canadian investigators were defined by treaties and legal frameworks designed for a world where financial assets had physical locations. Cryptocurrency assets have no physical location. The blockchain records where they are, but the blockchain is not in any jurisdiction. The address where the funds sit is a mathematical construct, not a geographic one, and the process of translating that mathematical fact into a legal claim that a specific country's courts can act on was novel in ways that added months and years to a recovery process that was already constrained by the limits of what could be found. The creditors who were waiting for distributions were waiting not just for the accounting to be completed, but for the international legal machinery to work through problems it had not previously encountered at this scale and with these specific characteristics. The delays were not failures of will. They were the friction of institutions built for one world operating in another. The second lesson is quieter and more difficult to systematize. It is about fraud that does not announce itself. Gerald Cotton was not visibly corrupt. He attended industry conferences. He gave media interviews. He maintained the external presentation of a successful founder whose platform was growing. His exchange processed real transactions. It had real customers who had real positive experiences with it for years. The fraud was not the entirety of the operation. It was a layer beneath an operation that, on the surface, functioned. This is why so many people trusted it for so long. And this is why the question of what happened in Jaipur, whether everything about the narrative presented to customers in courts was entirely true, has never been fully resolved in the minds of the people who lost money. The blockchain analysis is definitive. The forensic investigation is complete. The exhumation has been conducted and the findings issued. The passwords are gone. The wallets may be permanently inaccessible. And the man who chose to be the only person who knew the combination to the lock is confirmed dead by DNA analysis and confirmed as a fraudster by regulatory findings. And the story is over in every sense, except the sense that matters most to the 76,000 people still waiting to understand how someone they trusted could take everything. The specific regulatory framework that emerged in Canada in the years following Quadriga is worth examining as an example of how a single catastrophic event can reshape an entire regulatory posture. Before Quadriga, Canadian regulators had been cautious about asserting jurisdiction over cryptocurrency exchanges, partly because the technology was new, partly because jurisdictional questions were genuinely complex, and partly because the existing regulatory framework had not been designed with this class of financial intermediary in mind. After Quadriga, the Ontario Securities Commission and the Canadian Securities Administrators moved to register and supervise cryptocurrency exchanges that traded in securities, including most major cryptocurrencies, under existing securities legislation applied to a new context. The 2023 OSC report's specific recommendations, proof of reserves audited by independent third parties, custody arrangements requiring multi-signature authorization, segregation of customer assets from operating funds, mandatory disclosure of key personnel and their backgrounds, were direct translations of the specific failures the Quadriga investigation had documented into affirmative regulatory requirements. Every Canadian exchange operating today under this framework is operating in a regulatory environment that was shaped specifically and directly by what Gerald Cotton did and what Gerald Cotton failed to do. The rules exist because one man didn't follow rules that did not yet exist. The industry response to Quadriga also contributed to something less tangible than security standards. A shift in how the community thought about the relationship between the technology's promises and the institutions built to fulfill them. Bitcoin's distributed architecture is designed to eliminate the need for trusted intermediaries, to replace institutional trust with mathematical verification. But the exchanges through which most people accessed cryptocurrency were intermediaries, and they required exactly the kind of trust that the underlying technology was supposed to make unnecessary. The lesson of Quadriga, and of Mt. Gox before it, and of FTX after it, is that the technology can be trustless in ways the institutions cannot. Until the institutional layer catches up to the security guarantees of the cryptographic layer, the people who use those institutions are taking risks that the technology itself did not create and cannot protect them from. That insight, obvious in retrospect, devastating in its repeated redemonstration, is Quadriga's permanent contribution to the understanding of what cryptocurrency actually is, as distinct from what its advocates promise it will become. Close your eyes one more time. Somewhere in Nova Scotia, there is a grave. The body inside has been confirmed by science, by DNA analysis and forensic pathology, and the full weight of what modern forensic examination can establish. 11 days before leaving for India, a man updated his will, making careful provisions for everything he would leave behind. The properties, the aircraft, the yacht, the dogs in their trust fund, the detailed instructions for their care. He made no provision for the $250 million of customer money locked behind a password he carried exclusively in his own mind. Whether this was a catastrophic oversight, the product of a man who did not believe he would die at 30, or something more deliberate, a choice made by someone who understood exactly what he was doing, is a question that the forensic investigation answered in the aggregate, but that no living person can answer in the particular. The man who knows is gone. 76,000 people lost something they cannot fully get back. Most of them were ordinary Canadians who had chosen an ordinary-seeming Canadian exchange because it was accessible and because it worked, because it processed their deposits and handled their withdrawals, and appeared, in all the ways that financial institutions communicate trustworthiness, to be what it claimed to be. They did not make sophisticated gambles. They did not ignore obvious warnings. They trusted a platform that had been specifically designed to look trustworthy. And the story remains strange enough that the conspiracy theories will probably never stop entirely. Strange enough that people who have accepted every official finding carry a residual uncertainty that more time and more evidence have not fully dissolved. Because the alternative to the conspiracy theory is a story that asks you to accept that this much damage can be caused by this much ordinary human failure, and that the only person who could explain the full truth of what happened is confirmed dead and unavailable to explain it. The encrypted hard drive that holds access to Quadriga's cold storage wallets has not been abandoned by the people who were harmed by what it conceals. Forensic cryptocurrency recovery specialists have examined it. Password recovery experts have attempted to break the encryption using the specific techniques available for the encryption software Cotton is believed to have used. The court-appointed monitor commissioned professional attempts to access the wallets. None have succeeded as of the time these words were written. The encryption that Cotton used is, as far as anyone has been able to determine, correctly implemented, which means that the funds inside those wallets may be mathematically inaccessible in perpetuity, secured by the same cryptographic properties that make cryptocurrency secure against theft, now deployed accidentally or deliberately against the people who are owed what is inside them. The blockchain records show that the addresses exist. The blockchain records show that they have not moved. The funds are there, in a mathematical sense, present in the public record of the blockchain, attributed to specific addresses, unchanged since Cotton last touched them. They are simply locked, waiting. In the dark interior of a hard drive somewhere in Nova Scotia, in an encrypted state that has resisted every attempt to open it, a fortune sits in the specific kind of permanence that cryptography creates, not gone, but unreachable, which for the purposes of the people who are owed it is precisely the same thing. Sometimes the most unsettling stories are not the ones that require a conspiracy. Sometimes the most unsettling stories are exactly as simple as they appear. A man built a platform, a man committed fraud, a man died young, and a man left no way back in. The question that the Quadriga story leaves open, not about whether Cotton is dead, which the forensics have settled, but about whether anyone who trusted an exchange with their funds can ever fully know what is happening on the other side of the login screen, has no satisfying answer. The tools exist now that didn't fully exist then. Proof of reserves audits, on-chain verification, regulated custody requirements, multi-party key management. But the tools require the institution to use them, and the institution's willingness to use them is itself a form of trust that the tools are supposed to replace. The circle does not close entirely. It just closes more tightly than it did before, because 76,000 people paid the price of demonstrating where it had been open. Sleep now. The keys are gone. The wallets are locked, and somewhere in the dark interior of a hard drive that may never be read again, the full truth is stored in a language that needs a key to speak. And the key exists nowhere on earth, in no document.